In June 1522, the most powerful man in the world stood on the deck of his flagship, gazing at the fortress island that had defied him for too long. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent commanded an empire stretching from Hungary to Persia, but the small island of Rhodes, defended by just 600 knights of the Hospital of St. John, remained beyond his reach. For 6 months, the greatest siege force ever assembled would hammer against medieval walls defended by warrior monks who had sworn to die rather than surrender. Welcome to Saving History, where today we witness the impossible defense that became the Knights Hospitallers' finest hour and their most tragic defeat. To understand why Suleiman the Magnificent risked everything to capture Rhodes, we must first grasp the island's strategic importance in the eastern Mediterranean. Rhodes sat like a cork in a bottle, controlling the sea lanes between Constantinople and Egypt, between the Ottoman heartland and its vital North African provinces. From their fortified harbours, the Knights Hospitaller had transformed what should have been peaceful trade routes into a gauntlet of Christian corsairs who seized Muslim ships, enslaved their crews, and used the profits to fund their holy war against Islam. The Knights of the Hospital of St. John had not always been corsairs. Founded in Jerusalem around 1070 as a charitable organization to care for Christian pilgrims, they had evolved during the Crusades into one of Europe's most formidable military orders. When Saladin reconquered Jerusalem in 1187, the Hospitallers retreated first to Margat in Syria, then to Cyprus, and finally in 1310 to Rhodes, where they had ruled as sovereign princes for over 2 centuries. Under their governance, Rhodes had been transformed from a declining Byzantine outpost into the most formidable fortress in the eastern Mediterranean. The island's natural harbours were expanded and fortified, while the city of Rhodes itself became a masterpiece of military engineering. Massive walls, some sections over 40 feet thick, surrounded the medieval city, while the harbour was protected by chains and underwater obstacles that could trap enemy fleets. Most impressively, the knights had constructed a series of artillery bastions using the latest Italian designs, fortifications specifically designed to withstand cannon fire, rather than traditional siege engines. The transformation of Rhodes into a naval fortress reflected the Hospitallers' adaptation to changing military realities. Unlike their early years as heavy cavalry fighting pitched battles in the Holy Land, the knights had become masters of siege warfare, naval combat, and what we would now call asymmetric warfare. Their galleys, manned by volunteers, slaves, and adventurers from across Europe, operated with efficiency that made them the terror of Muslim shipping throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The knights' naval operations had become so effective that they were strangling Ottoman trade and communications. Muslim pilgrims travelling to Mecca faced capture and enslavement. Egyptian grain ships bound for Constantinople were seized as prizes. Most infuriating to Suleiman, the knights had developed intelligence networks that allowed them to intercept Ottoman diplomatic correspondence, giving European powers advance warning of Turkish military plans. Rhodes had become not just a military threat, but an intelligence hub that compromised Ottoman security across the region. The island's population reflected its unique character as a Christian fortress in Muslim waters. The city of Rhodes housed approximately 7,000 people, including 600 knights from across Europe, their military retainers, local Greek Christians who had prospered under Hospitaller rule, and a substantial Jewish community that had fled Spain after 1492. This diverse population shared a common understanding. Their survival depended on the island's defences and the knights' willingness to fight to the death against any Ottoman assault. The fortifications they trusted their lives to represented the culmination of medieval military engineering. The landward walls of Rhodes incorporated lessons learned from the Ottoman sieges of Constantinople and Belgrade, with massive bastions designed to provide overlapping fields of fire for the growing arsenal of artillery pieces the knights had accumulated. The harbour fortifications included the famous Tower of St. Nicholas, a fortress built on a rocky outcrop that controlled access to the main port, connected to the city by a massive mole that could be defended even if the outer walls fell. Perhaps most importantly, the knights had spent decades stockpiling supplies for the siege they knew must eventually come. Warehouses throughout the city contained grain sufficient for years of siege, while underground systems ensured water supplies even if the Ottomans controlled the countryside. Armories held thousands of weapons and millions of rounds of ammunition, much of it manufactured in the island's own foundries, using raw materials imported during peacetime. When Ottoman spies reported on Rhodes' defences in early 1522, they painted a picture that should have discouraged any rational commander. The island fortress was stronger than Constantinople had been in 1453, its defenders more experienced than any troops the Ottomans had previously faced, and its strategic position made blockade difficult and resupply of besiegers nearly impossible. But Suleiman the Magnificent was not merely rational, he was determined to remove this Christian thorn from the heart of his empire, regardless of cost. Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, was 57 years old when Ottoman scouts began appearing on the hills of mainland Anatolia, just visible across the narrow strait that separated Rhodes from the Turkish coast. A veteran of countless naval battles and siege defences, Villiers de l'Isle Adam understood both the magnitude of the threat approaching his island and the impossible nature of the decision he faced. With fewer than 600 knights and perhaps 4,500 additional fighting men, he would somehow have to defend Rhodes against an Ottoman Empire at the height of its power. The Grand Master had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. Born into minor French nobility around 1464, he had joined the Hospitallers as a young man and risen through their ranks during the Order's golden age of naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. He had commanded galleys in dozens of engagements against Ottoman fleets, participated in the unsuccessful defence of the Hospitaller castle at Bodrum in 1510, and witnessed firsthand the terrifying efficiency of Ottoman siege warfare during various campaigns throughout the region. What distinguished Villiers de l'Isle Adam from many of his predecessors was his clear-eyed understanding of military realities. Unlike some grand masters who had relied on divine providence and knightly valour, he approached the defence of Rhodes as a technical problem, requiring systematic solutions. Pittsburgh's freshmen sat straight in their chairs. He had spent years studying Ottoman siege tactics, particularly their innovative use of massive cannon and coordinated infantry assaults that had proven so effective against traditional medieval fortifications. Most importantly, he understood that successful defence required not just courage, but careful planning, resource management, and the ability to maintain morale during what would inevitably be a prolonged siege. The strategic situation facing the Grand Master was complicated by political realities beyond the island's shores. While Rhodes belonged to the Knights Hospitaller as a sovereign territory, their survival ultimately depended on support from the major Christian powers of Europe. Unfortunately, 1522 found European Christendom divided by the Habsburg-Valois rivalry between Emperor Charles V and King Francis I of France, with both rulers more concerned about their mutual conflicts than about Ottoman expansion in the eastern Mediterranean. Villiers de l'Isle Adam spent months sending urgent appeals to European courts, requesting reinforcements, supplies, and, most critically, naval support that might break an Ottoman blockade of the island. The responses had been uniformly disappointing. Charles V, whose territories were most directly threatened by Ottoman expansion, was simultaneously fighting France in Italy and dealing with the early stages of the Lutheran Reformation in Germany. Francis III, incredibly, was actually in secret negotiations with Suleiman for an alliance against the Habsburgs. The Pope issued stirring calls for a new crusade but provided little practical assistance. Recognizing that Rhodes would have to survive primarily on its own resources, the Grand Master implemented a series of defensive preparations that demonstrated both his strategic acumen and his willingness to make difficult decisions. He ordered the systematic demolition of suburbs and buildings outside the city walls that could provide cover for besiegers, despite the economic hardship this caused to local residents. He commanded the poisoning of wells and the destruction of food supplies throughout the island that might sustain an occupying army. Most controversially, he imposed strict rationing on the civilian population and began the forced conscription of every able-bodied man for military service. The military preparations were equally systematic. Villiers de l'Isle-Adam organized the defense around the existing structure of the order, with each national tongue or language group of knights responsible for defending specific sections of the walls. The French knights, the largest contingent, would hold the most vulnerable landward approaches. The Spanish and Italian knights would defend the harbour fortifications. The English, German, and other smaller contingents would serve as mobile reserves and specialists in artillery operations. Perhaps most importantly, the Grand Master addressed the psychological challenge of preparing men to fight what everyone understood would likely be a doomed defence, drawing on the Order's traditions and their sworn oaths to defend Christianity. He framed the coming siege not as a military campaign with conventional objectives, but as a religious test that would determine the eternal fate of every defender. Knights who died defending Rhodes would join the martyrs in paradise. Those who fled or surrendered would face eternal damnation as apostates who had abandoned their sacred duties. By spring, Villiers de l'Isle-Adam had transformed Rhodes into perhaps the most formidable fortress in the Christian world, defended by men who understood they were fighting not just for an island, but for their honour, their faith, and their souls. Suleiman, 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, was 27 years old when he decided that Rhodes must fall. History would remember him as the Magnificent. But in 1522 he was still a young ruler determined to surpass the achievements of his predecessors and prove himself worthy of the throne his father, Selim the Grim, had bequeathed to him. The Knights Hospitallers' continued defiance from their island fortress represented more than a strategic problem. It was a personal insult to a sultan who saw himself as God's representative on earth and the rightful heir to both Roman and Islamic imperial traditions. The decision to assault Rhodes was not made lightly. Suleiman's advisers were well aware that previous Ottoman attempts to capture the island had failed catastrophically. In 1480, an Ottoman force under Mesih Pasha had been repelled with heavy losses after a siege lasting several months. The failure had been blamed on inadequate preparation and insufficient artillery, but the underlying problem remained. Rhodes was simply too strong to be taken by conventional assault, and its island location made blockade extremely difficult to maintain. But Suleiman possessed resources that his predecessors had lacked. The Ottoman Empire of 1522 was at its absolute zenith, controlling territories from Hungary to Yemen and commanding wealth that dwarfed any European power. More importantly, Ottoman military technology had advanced dramatically since 1480, particularly in artillery and siege engineering. The cannon foundries of Constantinople could now produce weapons far larger and more effective than anything available during previous sieges, while Ottoman engineers had perfected techniques for mining fortifications and coordinating massive infantry assaults. The Sultan's strategic thinking extended beyond mere military considerations. Rhodes served as a base for Christian pirates who had made the eastern Mediterranean increasingly dangerous for Muslim shipping. Every captured vessel meant lost revenue for Ottoman merchants and humiliation for the empire's naval forces. More seriously, the Knights' intelligence networks provided European powers with detailed information about Ottoman military preparations, compromising the secrecy that was essential for successful campaigns. As long as Rhodes remained in Christian hands, no Ottoman operation in the Mediterranean could be considered secure. The preparation for the Rhodes campaign demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of Ottoman military organization at its peak. Beginning in late 1521, supplies and equipment began flowing toward assembly points along the Anatolian coast. Massive siege cannon were transported overland from the foundries of Constantinople, some requiring teams of hundreds of oxen and specially constructed roads to reach their destinations. Tens of thousands of troops were concentrated in camps around Marmaris, the closest Ottoman port to Rhodes, where they underwent intensive training in siege warfare and amphibious operations. The logistics of the operation were staggering in their scope and complexity. Ottoman records indicate that over 400 ships were assembled for the operation, ranging from massive galleons capable of carrying heavy artillery to smaller vessels designed for landing troops on defended beaches. The siege train included an estimated 100 cannon of various sizes, with the largest pieces capable of throwing stone balls weighing over 600 pounds. Perhaps 200,000 men were involved in various aspects of the operation, though the actual assault force would be considerably smaller due to the need for naval crews, supply personnel, and reserves. Suleiman personally supervised the final preparations, demonstrating the importance he placed on the operation's success. Unlike many Ottoman rulers who delegated military campaigns to their generals, the young sultan intended to command the siege personally, understanding that his reputation and authority were now inextricably linked to its outcome. His presence would inspire the troops and ensure that commanders at every level understood that failure was not acceptable. The intelligence gathered by Ottoman spies provided detailed information about Rhodes' defences, but also revealed the formidable challenge that awaited the attackers. The island's fortifications had been continuously strengthened since 1480, incorporating the latest European innovations in artillery-resistant design. The knights had stockpiled supplies sufficient for years of siege, while their control of the sea approaches meant that resupply during winter months would be extremely difficult for the besiegers. Despite these challenges, Suleiman remained confident that Ottoman superiority in numbers, artillery, and resources would eventually prove decisive. The siege of Rhodes would demonstrate to Europe that no Christian fortress, regardless of its strength or the courage of its defenders, could withstand the full might of the Ottoman Empire when properly applied. By summer, everything was ready for what would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges in Mediterranean history. On June 26, 1522, the horizon around Rhodes turned black with Ottoman sails as Suleiman's invasion fleet appeared off the island's coast. The sight that greeted the knights and citizens watching from the walls was both magnificent and terrifying. Over 400 vessels of every description, from massive siege ships carrying artillery to swift galleys packed with janissaries, stretching as far as the eye could see. This was not merely an army, it was the mobile embodiment of an empire's power, come to settle accounts with the Christian corsairs who had defied Ottoman authority for too long. The initial Ottoman landings met no resistance, as Villiers de l'Isle de Hard had correctly anticipated that attempting to defend the beaches would only result in the piecemeal destruction of his limited forces. Instead, the Grand Master had concentrated all his men within the city's fortifications, abandoning the rest of the island to the invaders, while ensuring that every defender would be positioned where he could do maximum damage to the attackers. From the walls of Rhodes, the knights watched Ottoman forces systematically occupy the entire island, establishing supply depots, artillery positions, and the elaborate siege lines that would soon begin strangling their fortress. Suleiman himself landed on June 28, establishing his command post on a hill overlooking the city, from which he could personally direct the siege operations. The Sultan's presence sent a clear message to both his own forces and the defenders. This was not a routine military operation that could be left to subordinates, but a campaign of such importance that the ruler of the Ottoman Empire would see it through to completion, regardless of cost or duration. The Ottoman siege methodology was as systematic as it was brutal. Rather than attempting immediate assault against the formidable walls, Suleiman's engineers began the methodical process of bringing their massive artillery within effective range while protecting their positions from counter-battery fire. Earthworks and gabions Wicker baskets filled with earth were constructed to shield the cannon from the knights' artillery, while trenches advanced incrementally toward the walls to allow infantry assault forces to approach under cover. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical siege works. Ottoman heralds appeared daily within shouting distance of the walls, offering generous terms for surrender. The knights would be allowed to depart with their personal belongings. The Greek population would retain their property and religious freedom, and the city would be spared the destruction that typically followed successful assaults. These offers were consistently rejected by Villiers de l'Isle Adam, who understood that surrender would mean the end of the Knights Hospitaller as an effective military force and the abandonment of their sacred oaths to defend Christianity. Demonstrated that the first major bombardment began in mid-July, with Ottoman artillery systematically targeting the most vulnerable sections of the city's walls. The largest cannon, some with barrels over 20 feet long, could hurl stone projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds with enough force to shatter medieval masonry that had stood for centuries. The defenders responded with their own artillery, engaging in deadly duels between gunners where a single well-placed shot could disable an enemy position or kill dozens of men. But the true horror of the siege lay not in the spectacular artillery exchanges, but in the grinding daily reality of life under constant bombardment. Ottoman cannon fired around the clock, making sleep impossible, and gradually wearing down both the physical defences and the psychological endurance of the defenders. Buildings throughout the city were systematically destroyed, forcing the civilian population into underground shelters where disease and despair took an increasing toll on morale. The knights responded to each Ottoman escalation with desperate ingenuity. When enemy miners began tunnelling beneath the walls, Hospitaller engineers dug countermines and fought vicious underground battles in cramped tunnels where swords and daggers were more effective than firearms. When Ottoman artillery created breaches in the outer walls, the defenders constructed new fortifications behind the damaged sections, forcing the attackers to begin their work anew. Most impressively, the knights maintained aggressive sorties against Ottoman positions, launching nighttime raids that disrupted siege works and demonstrated their continued willingness to fight despite impossible odds. By September, 3 months into the siege, both sides had suffered enormous casualties, while the strategic situation remained essentially unchanged. The Ottoman ring around Rhodes was complete and impregnable, but the city's defences remained intact, enough to prevent successful assault. Suleiman, the prolonged siege was becoming a political problem as well as a military challenge, with European observers noting that the mighty Ottoman Empire seemed unable to reduce a small island fortress defended by a few hundred knights. By October, the siege of Rhodes had settled into a horrific war of attrition that tested the endurance and ingenuity of both sides. 4 months of constant bombardment had reduced much of the city to rubble, but the knights' core fortifications remained intact, and their artillery continued to exact a steady toll on Ottoman forces. Suleiman faced an increasingly difficult strategic situation. Winter was approaching, making resupply of his siege army more difficult, while the prolonged campaign was consuming enormous resources that could be needed elsewhere in his vast empire. The Sultan's response was to escalate the siege to levels of intensity that shocked even veteran observers. Additional artillery was brought up from Anatolian depots, including some of the largest cannon ever constructed in Ottoman foundries. These massive pieces required specially built platforms and teams of hundreds of men to operate, but they could reduce sections of wall to rubble in hours rather than days. More ominously, Suleiman authorized the systematic use of mining operations designed to collapse entire sections of the city's defences simultaneously. Ottoman mining techniques had been perfected during decades of siege warfare across 3 continents, and the engineers deployed against Rhodes represented the finest practitioners of this deadly art. Working in shifts around the clock, They drove tunnels deep beneath the city's walls, carefully calculating the amount of gunpowder needed to bring down massive sections of fortification without damaging their own positions. The defenders could hear the mining work through the ground, leading to a terrifying psychological campaign where every sound might herald the collapse of their defences. Villiers de l'Isle Adam responded to the mining threat with characteristic determination and tactical skill. Hospitaller engineers, many trained in the military schools of Italy, where siege warfare had reached its highest development, began their own counter-mining operations. The result was a bizarre underground war, fought in narrow tunnels where men battled with swords and pistols in almost complete darkness, with victory going to whichever side could collapse the enemy's tunnels first or detonate their explosives most effectively. The most dramatic mining operation targeted the Bastion of England, a crucial fortification that protected one of the most vulnerable approaches to the city's inner defences. Ottoman engineers spent weeks driving a tunnel beneath the bastion's foundations, packing the excavated space with thousands of pounds of gunpowder. When the mine was finally detonated in early November, the explosion could be heard across the entire island, and the resulting collapse opened a breach in the walls large enough for thousands of assault troops to pour through simultaneously. But the knights had not been idle during the weeks of mining operations. Anticipating that the bastion would eventually fall, they had constructed a series of secondary defences behind the threatened section, including artillery positions specifically sited to rake any breach with devastating crossfire. When Ottoman assault troops poured through the gap created by the mine explosion, they found themselves trapped in a killing zone where Hospitaller cannon and small arms cut them down in heaps. The failed assault at the Bastion of England marked a crucial turning point in the siege, though not in the way either side initially understood. The Ottomans had demonstrated their ability to breach any section of the city's walls, but the knights had proved that breaches alone were insufficient to capture a fortress defended by disciplined troops willing to fight to the death. For Suleiman, this meant that successful capture of Rhodes would require either the complete destruction of its defences or the gradual elimination of its garrison through attrition. The Sultan chose attrition, implementing a siege strategy designed to slowly strangle the defenders rather than risk further costly assaults. Ottoman artillery fire was redirected from the walls toward the interior of the city, targeting the warehouses, cisterns and living areas that sustained the garrison. Simultaneously, the blockade of the island was tightened to prevent any possibility of resupply or reinforcement from European allies, who had so far provided only moral support for the knights' resistance. Inside the city, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Despite the careful preparations Villiers de l'Isle Adam had made before the siege began, food supplies, though still adequate, were being consumed faster than anticipated due to the larger garrison required to man the expanded defences. More critically, ammunition was running low despite the knights' pre-war stockpiling, with some types of artillery projectiles already exhausted and others rationed to prevent complete depletion. Perhaps most dangerously, disease was beginning to take a toll that exceeded battle casualties. The destruction of much of the city's infrastructure made sanitation almost impossible, while the crowded conditions in underground shelters created ideal circumstances for the spread of dysentery, typhus, and other epidemic diseases that had historically proven more deadly to siege garrisons than enemy action. By December, the siege of Rhodes had lasted 6 months, and both sides faced the prospect of a winter campaign that would test their endurance to the breaking point. Inside the battered city, Villiers confronted the harsh arithmetic of attrition warfare. His garrison had shrunk from over 5,000 men to fewer than 1,000, 500 effective fighters, ammunition stocks were critically low, and disease was spreading faster than his medical staff could contain it. Outside the walls, Suleiman's army had also suffered enormous casualties, but the Sultan commanded virtually unlimited reserves and could sustain losses that would cripple any European force. The Grand Master faced a decision that would define not only his own legacy, but the future of the Knights Hospitaller as a military order. Military logic dictated that further resistance was futile. The city's defences were irreparably damaged, the garrison was too weak to man the walls effectively, and no relief force was coming from Europe. Yet surrender would mean abandoning the sacred oaths that had defined the order for over 4 centuries, accepting the destruction of the last independent Christian state in the eastern Mediterranean, and effectively ending the knights' role as defenders of Christendom against Islamic expansion. The answer came through a series of private councils between Villiers de l'Isle de la Barton and his senior knights, meetings where men who had sworn to die rather than surrender wrestled with the reality that their deaths would serve no strategic purpose if they merely resulted in the slaughter of the civilian population they had sworn to protect. The Grand Master's genius lay in finding a solution that preserved both honour and lives. He would negotiate surrender terms that allowed the order to survive and continue its mission elsewhere, while ensuring that the people of Rhodes were protected from the massacre that typically followed successful sieges. The negotiations that followed were among the most remarkable diplomatic exchanges in medieval history. Suleiman, despite holding every military advantage, was surprisingly willing to offer generous terms that reflected his respect for opponents who had fought with such extraordinary courage and skill. The Sultan understood that his own reputation would be enhanced by magnanimous treatment of worthy enemies, while harsh terms might encourage other Christian fortresses to fight to the death rather than seek negotiated surrender. The final terms, agreed upon on December 20, 1522, represented a victory for both military realism and diplomatic sophistication. The knights would be allowed to depart Rhodes with full military honours, taking their weapons, personal possessions, and sacred relics. They would be provided with Ottoman ships to transport them to any Christian port of their choosing, and would be given 12 days to complete their evacuation. Most importantly, the Greek population of Rhodes would retain their property, their Orthodox Christian faith, and their traditional legal rights under new Ottoman administration. The evacuation of Rhodes, which began on January 1, 1523, was conducted with a dignity that impressed observers from both sides. The knights departed in formation, their banners flying and their armour polished, looking more like victors than the defeated garrison of a fallen fortress. Suleiman himself watched the procession from his command post, reportedly remarking that it pained him to drive such brave men from their homes, and that the world had rarely seen such courage in defeat. The Villiers de l'Isle was among the last to leave, ensuring that every knight, every soldier, and every civilian who wished to depart had been safely embarked before he finally stepped aboard the galley that would carry him away from the island the knights had ruled for over 2 centuries. As the ships carrying the remnants of the garrison disappeared over the horizon, both the Grand Master and the Sultan understood that they had participated in the end of an era in Mediterranean history. The fall of Rhodes marked the end of the Crusader states, the last remnants of the medieval Christian presence in the eastern Mediterranean that had begun with the First Crusade over 4 centuries earlier. But it also demonstrated that even in defeat, courage and honour could achieve a kind of victory. The Knights Hospitaller survived their evacuation from Rhodes to establish themselves on Malta, where they would face Suleiman again in an even more desperate siege 4 decades later. For Suleiman the Magnificent, the capture of Rhodes represented the culmination of his early military career and established his reputation as a conqueror worthy of his imperial ancestors. But the 6-month siege had also demonstrated the limits of Ottoman power when confronted by determined and skillful resistance. The knights had fallen, but they had exacted such a price that their very defeat became a warning to future opponents of what properly motivated defenders could achieve even against impossible odds. The Siege of Rhodes remains one of history's finest examples of how military honour can transcend victory and defeat, creating legends that outlast the kingdoms they defended and the empires they resisted. The knights had lost Rhodes, but they had not lost their honour, and honour, as Suleiman would discover, is a far more dangerous enemy than any fortress wall. In May 1565, 42 years after their humiliating defeat at Rhodes, the Knights of St. John found themselves facing the same enemy on a different island. Suleiman the Magnificent, now 70 years old and nearing the end of his legendary reign, had assembled the greatest armada in Ottoman history, 200 ships carrying 40,000 men, to finish what he had started at Rhodes. But these were not the same knights who had surrendered in defeat 4 decades earlier. These were men forged by exile, hardened by revenge, and determined to prove that Christian courage could triumph over impossible odds. When the remnants of the Knights Hospitaller departed Rhodes in January 1523, they carried with them more than their personal possessions and sacred relics. They carried the burning shame of defeat and an unquenchable thirst for revenge against Suleiman the Magnificent. For 7 years they wandered the Mediterranean as exiles, seeking a new home while maintaining their identity as a sovereign military order. Their salvation came from an unexpected source, Emperor Charles V, who needed a reliable force to defend his vulnerable Mediterranean territories against Ottoman expansion. The island of Malta, which Charles granted to the knights in 1530, seemed like a poor consolation prize for the loss of magnificent Rhodes. Smaller, more barren, and lacking natural harbours, Malta appeared to offer little strategic value beyond its position astride the shipping lanes between Ottoman territories in North Africa and Constantinople. The local population numbered fewer than 20,000, mostly impoverished farmers and fishermen who had endured centuries of raids by Muslim corsairs. The island's defences consisted of a few crumbling medieval fortifications that would have been inadequate against a determined assault by a well-armed galley, much less a major Ottoman expedition. But the Grand Master, who would transform Malta into an impregnable fortress, was cut from different cloth than his predecessors. Jean Parisot de Valette, elected to lead the order in 1557, was a veteran of the Rhodes siege, who had spent the intervening decades preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Ottoman power. Unlike previous Grand Masters who had relied primarily on the courage of their knights and the strength of their walls, Valette approached the defence of Malta as a comprehensive military engineering project that would incorporate the latest developments in artillery-resistant fortification design. The transformation of Malta began almost immediately after Valette's election. Working with Italian military engineers who had perfected the art of fortress design during the Italian wars, the knights began construction of new fortifications that would make Malta virtually impregnable against siege warfare. The key to their strategy was the creation of multiple defensive lines that would force any attacker to fight for every foot of ground while being subjected to devastating crossfire from carefully positioned artillery. The centrepiece of these defences was Fort St. Elmo, a star-shaped fortress built on a rocky promontory that controlled the entrance to Malta's 2 main harbours. Unlike traditional medieval castles designed to withstand scaling ladders and siege engines, St. Elmo incorporated revolutionary bastion defences that could withstand prolonged artillery bombardment while allowing defenders to bring overlapping fields of fire against any assault force. Every angle of the fortress was calculated to eliminate dead ground where attackers could find shelter, while underground passages allowed defenders to move reinforcements and supplies even under intense bombardment. Supporting St. Elmo were additional fortifications that created a defensive system of unprecedented complexity. Fort St. Angelo, built on the opposite side of the Grand Harbour, provided cross-harbour fire that made any naval assault extremely hazardous. The fortified city of Birgu, connected to St. Angelo by land, could house thousands of defenders and civilians during a siege, while its own walls incorporated the latest Italian innovations in artillery-resistant design. Most innovatively, the knights constructed a great chain that could be stretched across the harbour mouth, preventing enemy ships from entering the protected waters where Malta's own galleys sheltered. But Valette understood that fortifications alone would not suffice against the overwhelming numbers that Suleiman could bring to bear. The knights spent decades building intelligence networks throughout the Ottoman Empire. gathering detailed information about Turkish military preparations and diplomatic activities. They established supply agreements with European powers, ensuring that Malta would not face siege without adequate ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Most importantly, they recruited and trained a professional garrison that combined the elite fighting skills of the knights themselves with disciplined infantry and artillery specialists drawn from across Catholic Europe. By 1560, Malta had been transformed from a neglected backwater into perhaps the most formidable fortress complex in the Mediterranean world. But the ultimate test of Vivetli's preparations would come from the one enemy the knights had never forgotten, Suleiman the Magnificent, whose own aging mind remained obsessed with the Christian corsairs who continued to raid Ottoman shipping from their new island stronghold. Suleiman the Magnificent was 70 years old in 1565, an ancient age for a medieval ruler, but his hatred for the Knights of St. John burned as fiercely as it had during his youth at Rhodes 42 years earlier. The intervening decades had seen him conquer Hungary, besiege Vienna, and establish Ottoman dominance from the Crimea to Algeria, yet the small island of Malta continued to serve as a base for Christian corsairs who captured Muslim pilgrims bound for Mecca and disrupted the trade routes that connected his vast empire. The decision to assault Malta was driven by more than mere strategic considerations. It represented Suleiman's determination to complete the destruction of the Knights Hospitaller that he had begun at Rhodes. Intelligence reports from Ottoman spies described the island's new fortifications in detail, but also revealed that the garrison numbered fewer than 9,000 men, including only 600 knights. Against such a small force, Suleiman was prepared to deploy the largest armada in Ottoman history, a fleet so vast that its assembly would strain the resources of his entire empire. The preparations for the Malta campaign consumed nearly 2 years and demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of Ottoman military organization at its absolute peak. Shipyards from the Black Sea to North Africa contributed vessels to the Great Fleet, while the cannon foundries of Constantinople worked around the clock to produce the massive siege guns that had proved so effective against European fortifications. The elite Janissary Corps, supplemented by regular infantry units from across the empire, would provide an assault force of over 30,000 men, while thousands of additional troops would serve as engineers, artillery specialists, and support personnel. Command of this vast expedition was given to Mustafa Pasha, a veteran general who had distinguished himself in campaigns from Persia to Hungary. Mustafa understood both the potential rewards of success, the complete elimination of Christian naval power in the eastern Mediterranean, and the catastrophic consequences of failure. This was not merely another territorial conquest, but a campaign whose outcome would determine whether the aging Sultan's reign would end in triumph or humiliation. The fleet that departed Constantinople in March 1565 was a sight that struck terror into Christian observers throughout the Mediterranean. Over 200 ships of various sizes carried not only the assault force, but also the massive siege train that Mustafa intended to deploy against Malta's fortifications. The largest cannon required specially reinforced vessels and could fire stone projectiles weighing over 600 pounds, while thousands of smaller artillery pieces would provide the sustained bombardment needed to breach the Knights' walls. But the true strength of the Ottoman force lay not in its numbers or equipment, but in its experience and professionalism. These were not the tribal warriors who had conquered Anatolia 3 centuries earlier, but the products of a military system that had been perfected through generations of conquest across 3 continents. The Janissary units that would spearhead the assault had undergone years of training in siege warfare, while the engineers who would direct the mining operations had learned their craft during successful sieges from Baghdad to Belgrade. As the Ottoman Armada made its way westward through the Mediterranean, stopping at various ports to gather additional supplies and local reinforcements, European Christendom watched with mounting alarm. The Pope issued urgent calls for a new crusade, while the kings of Spain and France engaged in desperate diplomatic efforts to organize relief expeditions. But the harsh reality was that no Christian power possessed the naval strength to challenge the Ottoman fleet directly, while overland relief would take months to organize and transport to Malta. For Suleiman, the Malta campaign represented more than military conquest. It was his legacy operation, the final great enterprise that would complete his transformation of the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. Success would eliminate the last Christian naval threat in the eastern Mediterranean, open the sea routes to unrestricted Muslim shipping, and provide a base for future operations against Sicily and the Italian mainland. Failure was literally unthinkable for a sultan who had never known defeat and whose reputation rested on an unbroken series of military triumphs. As the great fleet approached Malta in May 1565, both sides understood that they were about to participate in a siege that would determine not just the fate of a small island, but the future balance of power between Christianity and Islam in the Mediterranean world. Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette stood on the ramparts of Fort St. Angelo on May 18, 1565, watching the horizon fill with Ottoman sails as the greatest armada in Mediterranean history approached his island fortress. At 68 years old, Valette had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. First as a young knight during the siege of Rhodes, then as an exile wandering the Mediterranean, and finally as the architect of Malta's transformation into an impregnable stronghold. Now, with fewer than 9,000 men under his command, he faced an Ottoman force that outnumbered his garrison by more than 4-1. But Valette possessed advantages that Suleiman's commanders could not fully appreciate from their intelligence reports. Unlike the knights who had defended Rhodes, these men had learned from defeat and spent 4 decades preparing for revenge. Every aspect of Malta's defences had been designed not merely to resist Ottoman assault, but to trap the attackers in a killing ground, where superior numbers would become a liability rather than an advantage. The strategic brilliance of Malta's defensive system lay in its ability to force the Ottomans to divide their forces while preventing them from bringing their full strength to bear at any single point. Fort St. Elmo, positioned on the rocky peninsula that separated Malta's 2 main harbours, could not be bypassed without leaving the Ottoman fleet vulnerable to crossfire from its artillery. Yet capturing St. Elmo would require a sustained siege operation that would consume enormous numbers of troops while the main fortress complex remained intact and fully manned. Valette had spent months studying Ottoman siege tactics, particularly their preference for massive frontal assaults supported by overwhelming artillery bombardment. The knight's defensive strategy was designed to negate these advantages by forcing the attackers into a series of costly individual operations, each of which would weaken the Ottoman force while preserving the defenders' strength for the ultimate confrontation. Every fortification on the island was positioned to provide mutual support, ensuring that the fall of any single position would not compromise the entire defensive system. The Grand Master's intelligence network had provided detailed information about Ottoman preparations, including the composition of Mustafa Pasha's force and the probable timeline for the assault. Unlike the surprise attack that had overwhelmed Rhodes, Malta would face a siege whose general outline was known in advance, allowing the defenders to position their limited manpower for maximum effectiveness. More importantly, Valette had established supply agreements with Sicily and Spain that would allow the garrison to sustain prolonged resistance even if the island were completely blockaded. The psychological preparation of the garrison was as important as the physical defences. Valette addressed his men on the eve of the Ottoman landing, reminding them that they were not merely defending an island, but fighting for the survival of Christian Europe. The fall of Malta would open the central Mediterranean to unrestricted Ottoman expansion, threatening Sicily, southern Italy, and ultimately Rome itself. This was not a territorial dispute that could be resolved through negotiation. It was a holy war, where defeat meant death or slavery for every defender. The civilian population of Malta presented both a challenge and an opportunity for the defensive strategy, unlike Rhodes, where the local Greek population had been largely neutral in the conflict between knights and Ottomans. The Maltese had suffered generations of raids by Muslim corsairs and understood that Ottoman victory would mean their enslavement, or worse. Ballet incorporated the entire population into his defensive plans, with every able-bodied man assigned to specific duties, ranging from ammunition supply to emergency repair of fortifications damaged by enemy bombardment. When the first Ottoman troops landed on the beaches of Masterclass Bay on May 20, 1565, they found an island that had been systematically prepared for their reception. Every well had been poisoned, every grain store destroyed, and every building that could provide shelter demolished. The knights had learned from their experience at Rhodes that siege warfare was ultimately a contest of endurance, and they were determined to ensure that time would work in their favour rather than against them. As Mustafa Pasha established his command post and began the systematic investment of Malta's fortifications, both sides understood that they were beginning a siege that would test the limits of human endurance and military skill. The question was no longer whether the Ottomans could capture Malta, but whether they could do so before their own army was destroyed by the effort. The siege of Malta began in earnest on May 24th, when Mustafa Pasha's artillery opened fire on Fort St. Elmo from carefully prepared positions on the heights overlooking the small fortress. The Ottoman commander had decided that St. Elmo must fall before any assault on the main defences could begin, understanding that the fortress's artillery could devastate any fleet attempting to enter the Grand Harbour. What neither Mustafa nor his subordinates understood was that they had fallen directly into the trap that Valette had prepared for them. Fort St. Elmo was designed to be a killing ground rather than a conventional fortress. Its small size, housing fewer than 150 knights and soldiers, made it appear vulnerable to rapid capture, but its bastioned walls and strategic position ensured that every assault would be costly beyond imagination. The fortress was connected to the main defensive complex by a narrow causeway that allowed reinforcements and supplies to flow in during the hours of darkness, while Ottoman forces were forced to attack across open ground under constant artillery fire from multiple directions. The initial bombardment of St. Elmo was the most intensive that Ottoman artillery had ever delivered against a single target. Massive cannon, some with barrels over 20 feet long, hurled stone projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds against walls that had been specifically designed to absorb such punishment. But the Knights' Italian engineers had incorporated the latest developments in military architecture, creating fortifications that could actually become stronger under bombardment as rubble filled the spaces between inner and outer walls. After 4 days of continuous bombardment had failed to create practicable breaches, Mustafa ordered the first infantry assault on St. Elmo. The result was a massacre that shocked even veteran Ottoman commanders. Janissary units that had conquered fortresses from Baghdad to Belgrade found themselves trapped in carefully prepared killing zones, where overlapping fields of fire from hidden positions cut down entire formations before they could reach the walls. Those few attackers who did gain the ramparts were systematically eliminated by knights, fighting with the desperate efficiency of men who knew that retreat was impossible. The failure of the initial assault revealed the fundamental flaw in Ottoman siege strategy. Traditional Ottoman tactics relied on overwhelming firepower to create breaches that could be exploited by rapid infantry assault, but the bastion design of St. Elmo meant that apparent breaches were actually carefully prepared defensive positions that became more deadly as attackers concentrated their efforts against them. Mustafa's response to the failure was to escalate the siege to levels of intensity that consumed his army's strength at an alarming rate. Additional cannon were brought up from the fleet, while mining operations began that would eventually undermine entire sections of the fortress's foundations. Most critically, the Ottoman commander began rotating his assault forces in continuous attacks that maintained pressure on the defenders, while ensuring that his own troops were gradually worn down through constant combat. The defence of St. Helena became the stuff of legend as knights and soldiers fought with superhuman determination against impossible odds. When the fortress's wells were destroyed by Ottoman mining, the garrison continued fighting without water in the Mediterranean summer heat. When the walls were breached by massive explosions, the defenders constructed new positions from rubble and corpses. Most remarkably, when casualties reduced the garrison to fewer than 50 effective fighters, volunteers continued to infiltrate the fortress from the main complex, choosing certain death for the chance to kill a few more enemies. The psychological impact of St. Elmo's resistance extended far beyond the fortress itself. Ottoman troops, accustomed to rapid victory against European opponents, found their morale gradually eroding as week after week passed without decisive success. More importantly, the enormous casualties required to maintain the siege were consuming the elite units that would be essential for the eventual assault on the main defensive complex. Every janissary killed at St. Elmo was a veteran warrior who could not be replaced during the campaign. When Fort St. Elmo finally fell on June 23rd, after 31 days of continuous siege, fewer than a dozen defenders remained alive. But their sacrifice had cost Mustafa Pasha over 8,000 casualties, including some of his finest troops and most experienced commanders. As the Ottoman general surveyed the ruins of the small fortress that had consumed nearly a quarter of his army, he reportedly remarked that if the outer fortress had cost so dearly, what price would the inner defences demand? The fall of Fort St. Elmo marked the beginning rather than the end of Malta's agony. Mustafa Pasha, having paid an enormous price in blood and time to capture the outer fortress, now faced the main defensive complex across the Grand Harbour. A system of fortifications that made St. Elmo appear like a minor outwork by comparison. Fort St. Angelo and the fortified town of Birgu presented interlocking fields of fire protected by walls 40 feet thick in some places, defended by the surviving knights and a garrison that had grown more determined rather than demoralized by their comrades' heroic sacrifice. The Ottoman commander faced a strategic dilemma that would have challenged the greatest military minds in history. His army, though still numbering over 25,000 effective fighters, had been significantly weakened by the month-long siege of St. Elmo. More critically, the summer heat and inadequate supply arrangements were beginning to take a toll that exceeded battle casualties. Disease was spreading through the Ottoman camps, while water shortages and poor sanitation created conditions that would eventually prove as deadly as enemy fire. Mallet, observing from the ramparts of St. Angelo, understood that the siege had entered its most dangerous phase. The knights had successfully executed the first part of their defensive strategy by making the Ottomans pay an enormous price for a minor objective, but the main assault would test whether Malta's defences could withstand the full fury of an empire determined to avenge its humiliation. With fewer than 6,000 men remaining in the garrison, every subsequent casualty would be irreplaceable. The bombardment of the main defences began on July 15th and quickly escalated to an intensity that made the assault on St. Elmo appear modest by comparison. Ottoman artillery, repositioned and reinforced with additional guns brought up from the fleet, delivered a continuous barrage that could be heard across the entire Mediterranean. The massive walls of St. Angelo and Bergo, designed to absorb such punishment, gradually began showing signs of damage as thousands of stone projectiles pounded the same positions day after day. But the true test would come with the infantry assaults that Mustafa launched once his engineers reported that practicable breaches had been created in the fortress walls. The attacks that began in late July were coordinated efforts, involving thousands of elite troops supported by the full weight of Ottoman artillery. Emissary units, reinforced by regular infantry and volunteers from across the Muslim world, advanced under covering fire that was intended to suppress the defenders' response and allow assault troops to reach the walls before organized resistance could develop. The first great assault on August 7 nearly succeeded in overwhelming the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Ottoman troops broke through the outer defences at several points and engaged in hand-to-hand combat within the fortress courtyards themselves. For hours the outcome of the siege hung in the balance as knights and Ottoman soldiers fought with swords and daggers among the ruins of buildings destroyed by artillery fire. Only a desperate counter-attack led by Valette himself, fighting in the front ranks despite his advanced age, managed to drive the attackers back and restore the defensive line. The failure of the August assault marked a turning point in Ottoman morale, as troops who had expected rapid victory found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker under pressure. More importantly, casualties from the failed attack had reduced Mustafa's effective strength to fewer than 20,000 men, while intelligence reports indicated that Spanish relief forces were finally being organized in Sicily. The siege that was supposed to have ended in weeks was entering its fourth month with no clear prospect of success. Valet's response to the crisis was to launch a series of sorties that took the psychological warfare directly to the enemy camps. Knights and soldiers, fighting with the desperate courage of men defending their homes and faith, struck at Ottoman positions during the hours of darkness, disrupting siege operations and demonstrating that the garrison retained the initiative despite being vastly outnumbered. These attacks inflicted relatively few casualties but had an impact on Ottoman morale far beyond their material effect. As September approached, both commanders understood that the siege was approaching its climax. Mustafa's army was weakening daily through disease and casualties, while approaching autumn weather would make continued operations increasingly difficult. For Violet, the arrival of Spanish reinforcements represented the last hope for survival. The next phase of the battle would determine whether the Knights' impossible gamble had succeeded, or whether Malta would join Rhodes as another monument to Ottoman power. On September 7, 1565, Spanish ships appeared on the horizon carrying 8,000 fresh troops under the command of Don Garcia de Toledo, Viceroy of Sicily. For the Knights defending Malta, who had endured over 3 months of continuous siege, the sight of Christian banners approaching the island represented nothing less than divine intervention. But for Mustafa Pasha, whose army had been reduced to fewer than 15,000 effective fighters, the arrival of enemy reinforcements meant that his impossible situation had become hopeless. The Ottoman commander faced a choice that would define his place in history. With his army weakened by months of costly assaults and ravaged by disease, any attempt to fight both the garrison and the relief force simultaneously would likely result in complete destruction. Yet retreat would mean acknowledging that the mighty Ottoman Empire had been defeated by a handful of Christian knights on a barren island, a humiliation that would echo throughout the Muslim world and encourage Christian resistance across the Mediterranean. Mustafa chose to fight, ordering a final desperate assault on the main fortress complex while simultaneously positioning part of his remaining force to contest the Spanish landing. The result was a strategic disaster that demonstrated how completely the initiative had shifted to the defenders. Ottoman troops, exhausted by months of siege warfare and demoralized by their failure to capture what should have been an easy target, found themselves caught between two enemy forces, with no possibility of mutual support between their divided commands. The final assault on Fort St. Angelo began before dawn on September 8th, with the remaining Janissary units launching what everyone understood would be their last attempt to capture the fortress that had cost them so dearly. The attack achieved initial success, with Ottoman troops reaching the ramparts and engaging in the savage hand-to-hand combat that had characterized the entire siege. But the knights who met them were no longer the desperate defenders of earlier months. They were men fighting with the confidence that comes from knowing relief is at hand and victory is possible. Grand Master Violet, now 68 years old and bearing multiple wounds from months of continuous fighting, personally led the counter-attack that drove the final Ottoman assault from the walls of St. Angelo. Contemporary accounts describe the aged warrior moving through the fortress courtyards like an avenging angel, inspiring his men through personal example while directing the tactical movements that would seal the enemy's defeat. When the last Ottoman standards disappeared from the ramparts, both sides understood that the siege was effectively over. The Spanish landing at Melilla Bay proceeded against minimal resistance, as Mustafa had been forced to commit most of his remaining troops to the failed assault on the fortress. Don Garcia's professional soldiers, fresh from campaigns in Italy and North Africa, quickly established a beachhead and began advancing inland toward the Ottoman siege lines. Caught between the relieving force and the garrison that now sallied forth from behind their walls, the remnants of the Ottoman army began a chaotic retreat that soon became a rout. The evacuation of Ottoman forces from Malta was conducted under such desperate circumstances that most equipment and supplies had to be abandoned. The great siege guns that had battered the island's fortifications for months were spiked and left behind, while thousands of wounded soldiers were simply abandoned to the mercy of their enemies. Of the 40,000 men who had landed on Malta in May, fewer than 10,000 boarded the ships that would carry them back to Constantinople. The impact of the Ottoman defeat extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. For the first time in over a century, a major Ottoman expedition had not only failed to achieve its objectives, but had been completely destroyed in the attempt. The myth of Ottoman invincibility, carefully cultivated through generations of conquest, lay shattered on the rocky shores of a small Mediterranean island defended by men who had refused to accept the possibility of defeat. Suleiman the Magnificent, receiving news of the disaster in his palace at Constantinople, reportedly aged years in a single day. The Sultan, who had never known defeat, now faced the humiliation of explaining to his subjects how the greatest armada in Ottoman history had been destroyed by 600 Christian knights and their allies. The failure at Malta marked the beginning of the end for Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, establishing the Knights Hospitaller as the victors in their 40-year quest for revenge. The impossible had become reality. The hammer had become the anvil, and the Knights of St. John had achieved their ultimate vindication. And so we close another chapter in our journey through the rich tapestry of medieval history. Thank you for walking alongside us through these corridors of time. If today's exploration has sparked your curiosity about the Middle Ages, we'd love to have you join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Subscribe to Saving History on your favorite podcast platform to ensure you never miss our latest discoveries from the medieval world. Remember, every castle has a story, every stone holds secrets, and every episode brings us closer to understanding the extraordinary lives of those who came before us. Until our next medieval adventure, this is your host, Hunter, reminding you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and above all, keep saving history.